And now we'll start Facebook. That's good. And miracle of miracles, we are live. So good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And real treat to have Peter Mann with us this evening, whose brand new book, and this is The Torqued Man. And what a wonderful, cover and image. We can get into the symbolic importance of this too. But this is the advanced reading copy, and Peter has kindly signed a batch of books for us, which should be here pretty soon. There's a finished copy.
The real one, yeah.
Yeah. So if you have questions for Peter, I'm going to stay on the program tonight, but I will be watching the comments and chat feature of Facebook and YouTube. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in as they occur to you. And so Barbara and I are going to have a fun time doing a tag team program tonight. So Barbara?
Well, thank you, Patrick. No, it's really going to be fun. Patrick knows a lot more about Irish mythology, history, and all the rest of it than I do. However, I am wearing my green jacket that I bought at, I think it's called Kildare Abbey, somewhere in County Mayo. So I'm lending a slight touch of authenticity to all this. So this is, as I understand it, a debut novel. Is that right, Peter?
It is.
Excellent. And if any of you have tried to look up Peter Mann, you will see there are several people who writing different things as Peter Mann. So it's important that you recognize his face. Anyway, we'll put it that way, in order to identify which Peter Mann he actually is. So Peter, what drew you to writing this particular book, and especially what drew you towards writing about an Irish and German relationship, difficult, controversial, whatever, during World War II? It's not something we often read about.
Well, that's good. That means there's space for this story. I'm glad to hear it. First, let me just say thanks, Barbara and Patrick, for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so sorry. I forgot to drink a toast to you.
Oh, yeah.
Right. We can all raise our Patrick's beverage. It's disgusting because it's old, but Peter and I are in good shape. I hope we have
Sorry, Patrick, you're
going to keel over.
I know, it's not very hard boiled, is it? Stevia.
It's all right. Probably laced with grain alcohol, I'm sure.
Right. BYOB is an important thing to start off our events. Anyway, carry on.
I appreciate it. Yeah. So what drew me to this story and why Ireland and Germany? Well, I have to say that the two were kind of put together for me in terms of a real historical figure. That was the initial inspiration for this novel. Yeah. The real historical figure's name is Frank Ryan. And his kind of wild biography did a lot of legwork for me in terms of delivering me a kind of ready-made premise. Frank Ryan, let me tell you a little about the real guy. He, like Frank Pike in my book, was an Irish Republican socialist who went over to Spain to fight fascism against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. He got captured, he got sentenced to death. His death sentence was commuted and was basically left to rot in a Francoist prison for life, until, lo and behold, who should show up in 1940, early after the Spanish Civil War, early into World War II, but the Germans, the Abwehr, Germans military intelligence. And they made him this deal that he really couldn't refuse, which was, we'll give you your freedom if you agree to help us with the planned invasion of Britain. So early in the war, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany had, of course, its eyes on invading Britain. It's called Operation Sea Lion. And they thought that the IRA, right, would be perfect. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
So they spring Ryan from prison, and of course, as we all know, the invasion of Britain never happens. Germany gets sucked into the war in the East, and this real guy, Frank Ryan, ends up basically rotting, kind of left on ice throughout the war in Berlin, never getting his chance, but having kind of consummated this deal with the devil. And so I had read about this. I was reading some stuff about the Spanish Civil War, and it just kind of lit me up. And I thought, wow, what a perfect kind of opportunity for a novel, because there have been a couple of biographies about Frank Ryan, but we don't really know, other than a few letters, of what he was really up to, what he really thought about the kind of fraught position he was in. This guy was an explicit anti-fascist who's now living in Nazi Germany in cahoots with them. And so I just thought, what was someone like him really up to? And so then I took that as a jumping off point and then made it my own. And the thing that really stood out to me then was this relationship between Pike, this Irish spy, and his German spy handler. And I thought, what an interesting kind of vexed, complicated relationship that could be.
Which indeed it is. Now you're calling him Frank, but in fact you've given him a name that I found somewhat difficult to pronounce. So why don't you tell us what his actual name is?
Oh, sure. So his actual name is Proncius Pike. And he goes by Frank. But really, in at least one of the manuscripts we have in the novel, he's known by Pike, by his last name. This is of course complicated by the fact that in the other manuscript we have, he is known by his alter ego, which is Finn Mccool, the great Celtic hunter and warrior of Irish legend.
Oh, a chance to talk about Irish legend. Tell us about Finn Mccool. Let's just digress into that, because I think Cuchellen and Finn Mccool are fascinating figures.
Yeah, so Finn Mccool is this, like so many figures of Irish myth, this larger than life character he's a leader of a band of warriors and hunters, the Fianna, and they roam the forest. He serves the High King of Ireland. He gets into all sorts of scrapes, and he's this prominent figure in Irish myth, part of what's called the Fenian cycle. And there's all sorts of stories about him dating back to God knows when. I think as early as the 6th century, if not older. I always thought he was a fascinating character because he has genuinely heroic qualities. He's very strong and he's brave, but he's also kind of a liar and similar to Odysseus, right? He's always getting in tough scrapes, then getting out of them through through his wits, but often in kind of demeaning ways. Like he poses as a baby in one story, as I remember, to fool a giant.
He has a bit of the Flashman in him.
Yes, absolutely. Which must have been totally right on, Patrick. It must have been what drew me to him, because I just love the MacDonald Fraser novels.
That's great. Yeah,
so good.
Is Finn Mccool the character that is supposed to have walked the giant steps away from Ireland towards Scotland?
Yeah, they were formed. Like one of the stories tells kind of the origin story of how they were formed when I can't remember if he chased the giant back there, or Patrick, you probably recall the specifics more than I do.
Not so well. I mean, is the Fenian cycle the same as the Ulster cycle, or are they two different cycles?
No, as I understand it, and I'm by no means an expert in Irish myth. I just kind of I mined this for the book and got interested in it just with a little bit of knowledge. The one Irish myth I had read was the Toyne, which is, as I understand it, part of the Ulster cycle. The Toyne tells the story of the cattle raid, and it features the hero, the other one you mentioned, Barbara, of Cuchellen. Cuchellen is, again, this ferociously strong, death-dealing figure who launches this one-man stand against evil Queen Medb, and all to protect some of the Ulstermen's cattle. And I think he's only 16 or 17, but it's this incredible story where he just kills man after man after man. But what I love about the Fenian cycle, and what I love about the Toyne, is they're written with the kind of already even kind of deep in these myths. There's a kind of Irish wit coming through, and just a kind of off-kilter use of language that I found so stunning. Obviously, I'm reading them in translation, and in fact, I should admit, I'm happy to admit that the title, "The Torqued Man," was something I stole from a translation of the Toyne by Kieran Carson, great Irish translator, recently deceased, who in talking about Cuchellen, he undergoes one of these, he undergoes a kind of fit similar to the Vikings who would go into a kind of a battle rage and frenzy, and they go berserk, right? They become berserkers, and they kind of shape shift, and who knows if they were taking psychedelic mushrooms or whatever. But in any event, Cuchellen undergoes this transformation where all of his joints and organs and facial features get rearranged before he gets into this, battle frenzy. And in Carson's translation, they call him the torquing. The torquing is when he becomes the torqued man. So I wonder
if the Incredible Hulk is a modern day interpretation of the torqued man.
Yeah, no coincidence. He's green, right?
He is green, right?
Well, I think these bodies of myth, country to country, are so fascinating. I fell in love with the Mabinogion, which is the Welsh body. And there was a guy named Lloyd Alexander who wrote a wonderful series of books, not dissimilar to Tolkien, but for young adults. I can't remember, Patrick, if we still have them in the store, but they were a huge success for a long time. I think there were 6 of them. And so, the Mabinogion is its own thing. And then you can read, most of us in Western, been educated in Western institutions, know a lot of Greek mythology. And, we've read Bullfinch, or we've read whoever it might be, and they're quite different. And, we know about the Vikings, but I think possibly the Irish are the least well known of these major. I mean, Iceland has its own too, right? I can't remember what they're called, but there's a name for a whole Icelandic.
The sagas, the Snorri.
Yeah, but I wonder, the Irish seem to me more akin to the Scandinavian than they do, the Welsh, or going even farther east towards Greece. Certainly they're nothing really like the Greek legends. What do you think, Patrick? Do you think there's a lot of Norse influence in the Irish?
I would, if I had to guess, I would say yes, right? I don't know. What do you think, Peter?
It seems to me, again, I'm no expert in this, but it seems like there's a lot of cross traffic, a lot of cross fertilization in these myths. I mean, I think even among the Greek myths too. And I think there's even folks who kind of trace that, some of the genealogies of this, that it's not just, consonant patterns emerging in separate traditions, but actually there's some real cultural transmission. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. One of the things that Mary Renault points out really well, and I can't remember exactly where I remember this from, but in countries with a lot of sunshine, daylight, and so forth, the fact that that men fathered children was more easily discerned. But in the Mabinogion, some in the other cultures that were farther north, where there was lots of mist and clouds and dark and all, women had more power than, because it wasn't easily perceived just how reproduction actually worked. And so the bodies tend to reflect that. The bodies of myth reflect that. I've always thought that was a fascinating. I'm being a little vague here because it's so long since I read it, but I was always very taken with that idea that the shift from the mother goddess to the pater, the father, is quite marked and generally follows climate.
Yeah, that's cool. I think I've only read The King Must Die, what seems like a million years ago, but I remember loving it.
Yes, well, I heard 2 Theseus ones, The Bull from the Sea and The King Must Die, are completely brilliant, right? It's a retelling of Theseus and Ariadne and so forth. But I was just, going back to the Irish, the idea of the strong men, the role of women and so forth. I think there's a lot to do with climate and geography and how these myths, I mean, same thing would be true in Wales. And, we're also talking, because we're also climate conscious right now, about a time when, the world was colder and mistier and darker.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about climate and kind of the role ecology plays, one of the attributes of Finn Mccool is that he's eaten of the salmon of wisdom, as it's called. And so after having eaten the salmon of wisdom, he only has to suck his thumb to be able to see the future, which I thought was a wild trait.
There's kind of a Monty Python vibe about it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, part of what I've attempted to do here is to smuggle in a bit of that kind of Monty Python-esque and MacDonald Fraser Flashman novel-esque qualities to the Finn Mccool narrative we get in this book, which is, of course, we're in the most dire and grim of circumstances. We're in Nazi Berlin in the middle of World War II for really the entirety of the novel. Francoist Spain at the beginning. And so, without trying to, make light of those events, the idea, the part of the challenge I think I was up against is to kind of balance the grimness, right, and the seriousness and the high stakes of this kind of story I want to tell about a World War II story about complicity and resistance, but also to lace that with a kind of madcap, rollicking humor as well, at least in the narrative that Pike is telling about himself as Finn Mccool. I have to say too that a large part of my inspiration was not just the myths themselves, but a incredible kind of rehashing of those myths by Flann O'Brien in his 1939 novel At Swim Two Birds. That really gave me the kind of inspiration for the kind of overtly
reminded me of Flann O'Brien.
Yes.
and James Stevens. Yeah.
Good notes, sir. Very good.
Love Flann O'Brien so much.
Me too. Yeah, when I first read that book, I've read it a few times now, and when I first read it, it blew me away, and I just kind of tucked it away in the back of my brain as something I would do something with. And then I think when I read about Frank Ryan, somehow those two completely unrelated things set up a spark in my brain. And I thought, how can I take the kind of hilarious phrases of Finn Mccool as the character in O'Brien portrays him, this idea that, Finn McCool's back was as wide as like 6 handball courts and just things like that. And how could I smuggle that into a kind of totally incongruous environment like Nazi Germany?
Right.
Excellent.
Well, I mean, the book gets, kicks off with the, just after the war ends in 1945, amid the rubble, and these two manuscripts are found. And this is, I'm not going to get, there are spoilers, so we have to be very careful about not giving away spoilers. But the basic setup is really ingenious, it's told through these alternating narratives. One is told in a first-person journal, and then the other is told in the Flann O'Brien, third person, almost a novelization. And the Pike story, Finn Mccool story, I love how you kind of create its own little cycle within, with these different episodes. Can you just kind of basically introduce those two narratives? Sure.
So yeah, just like you said, Patrick, the reader's presented with 2 found manuscripts, like you said, found in the rubble in 1945 by American occupying forces, following the arrest of one of our protagonists, Adrian de Groot. So the first of these manuscripts, right, is the journal of de Groot, who is a Abwehr agent, essentially German military intelligence. The role he comes to occupy in the novel once he moves to Berlin fairly early on is that of of a spy handler. He's in charge of the sabotage agents awaiting deployment to other parts of Europe during the war. And so Adrian's journal, which it's found in 1945. It's a journal that's begun in the fall of 1943. Just at the beginning of the bombing of Berlin that starts in, I think, November 1943, and goes, this is mostly British bombing, and goes really for a solid 6 months, ruthless bombing campaign that destroyed at least most of the western half of the city. And even he's writing this during this bombing, kind of hunkered down in his bunker. And I don't think it's giving anything away because it's literally the first line of the novel, which is that Frank Pike is dead. So it's recalling basically having found out the news of his friend and at times lover and his charge of this man's death. He kind of launches into an account of his life and their relationship together. And of course, it kind of takes him into a thicket of memories that he wasn't really prepared to go into. And then there's something, the manuscript takes on its own momentum. And so we get in the diary, we get a sense of real-time 1943 into 1944 of what it's like to live in Berlin during the bombing. And as the war kind of gets grimmer and grimmer for Berliners, the tide of the war is turning against Germany. It also, and de Groot's own kind of narrative proceeds, like in terms of his character arc, occurs while he's recording his early relationship with Pike. The other manuscript we're given is, like you said, I think of it too in this way, a novelization written presumably by Pike, called Finn Mccool in the Bowels of Teutonia, considering his murderous exploits in Berlin. And it's written in that kind of mock heroic, arch comic tone, which was so much fun to write. I got to say, I enjoyed inhabiting both voices of these characters, and part of, I think, the joy of writing this was to try to, come up with distinct voices and then pair them together in kind of interesting, contrasting ways. And so Finn's narrative is about him. It starts like any good epic in media res, right? He's in the middle of this factory. It's called the Hammer factory, that's run by Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell, which was a real thing. He was a real guy, and he ran this factory he had his own business of different like serums and hormone injections, all sorts of kind of bogus health serums that he got from sourcing from the far eastern reaches of the Reich during the war, from like Ukraine and Western Russia.
It's like medicine show stuff.
Totally. He would take, the glands of goats and pigs and cows and mix them together into his health cures and inject them in people, including Hitler himself, as well as all sorts of celebrities and, people in the elite cabinet of the Reich. Anyways, Finn we find him in the middle of his mission to launch this kind of one-man death-dealing insurgency, along the lines that you would find in a kind of, Fenian or Cuchellen myth of a single one-man stand, right, to take down the Reich, which sounds preposterous, and yet it's not supposed to just read as clear fantasy, because as we come to learn, the two narratives absolutely intersect, and there's ways that you can't just discard Finn's as pure fantasy.
Well, it's great seeing them kind of circle around each other, just as individuals. And also, you're never really sure if the tale that either one of them is telling is quite accurate, is quite what really is happening. I mean, you assume, because they both have lots of secrets, and you assume that de Groot, because it's more of a straight narrative, you assume that what he's telling you is correct, but you're not really sure.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, they're both unreliable narrators in that sense. And in the sense, I think, all first-person narratives in some sense are unreliable narrators, because they all have an agenda to present, and de Groot certainly does, in the sense that I think we come to learn pretty quickly that he is complicit in a system that he abhors, and he's kind of at pains to reconcile himself to that. So in some ways, he's trying to rationalize kind of, why he's caught in the position he is, working essentially for Hitler's Germany, why he's working for German military intelligence during the war, when he knows full well the horrors that are involved, and as we come to learn, is not just aware, but deeply complicit in these, while at the same time, he himself is an anti-Nazi, right? He finds the Nazis and Hitler despicable, and yet he's kind of fallen into this. Like I think so many, part of what fascinates me about this time, right, is how politics kind of acts as a vortex that sucks people into to opposing sides, who wouldn't have otherwise, in different circumstances, would never have been involved, would never become spies or working for the state.
Well, Barbara and I both knew Barbara knew him a lot better than I did, but Philip Kerr, magnificent novelist. And I was thinking about, the March Violets. And there's I thought a really interesting, revealing thing early on in the book that speaks to this. This is de Groot speaking. He says, in my naivete, I had believed a conservative stand against the excesses of materialism would preserve the soul, and with it art, which is always in its authentic form an expression of the soul. Didn't work out so well. But do you think that was a pretty popular opinion? And I think a lot of the upper class kind of aristocratic Germans thought that this was a passing phase, right? Early on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a kind of evocative of the conservative humanist stance, I would say. Folks who were like de Groot, I would say he is a conservative anti-Nazi humanist who thinks that, yeah, he thought these folks didn't take the Nazis seriously until it was too late, and then they're forced into being kind of into this kind of unholy alliance. It's a very uncomfortable one, but one that that folks with more power than de Groot sanctioned. It also becomes as the war drags on, this becomes the basis of the real kind of resistance to Hitler late in the war, with, for example, the July 20th plot in 1944, where they attempted to assassinate Hitler, and they had attempted multiple times before. But that comes really out of a kind of conservative, aristocratic civil servant position, who I think inhabited that kind of view. Part of my inspiration for de Groot's view, that particularly that idea you expressed or quoted from, is Thomas Mann, who is one of my favorite authors. And Thomas Mann underwent quite a political kind of development over the course of the rise of Hitler. He moved, but in World War I, he was this kind of ardent nationalist and an arch conservative, who, and in some ways, I kind of lifted that idea straight out of Thomas Mann's Reflections of an Unpolitical Man, which he wrote over the course of World War I. But by the time the Weimar Republic emerges and Nazism appears on the scene, he realizes that he has to defend, that to defend kind of humanist German tradition means defending a republic, defending democracy, and standing against Nazism. And it takes him a while to kind of come to that position. But he was kind of a guiding influence for me, as well as I should say his novel Dr. Faustus, which is structurally kind of similar in the sense that Dr. Faustus is, of course, the story of a composer, Adrian Leverkuhn, who makes a deal with the devil, and in some sense meant to be a kind of allegory for Germany's descent into Nazism, this kind of demonic element of the soul that is somehow embedded in the German romantic tradition. That story Mann tells through the perspective of a friend. So it's about this gifted figure, a composer named Adrian, who is his life story is told by his friend Serenes Zeitblom. So I thought that was an interesting kind of conceit for telling a story, is the story of a life from the perspective of a friend who, has kind of feelings of longing, unrequited longing, I think, and that I kind of imported that into the novel as well.
It's interesting how hard everybody works to try to make sense out of Hitler and the entire rise of the Reich and the good German and all the rest. I mean, we're seeing something similar going on right now here in this country. One of the things two things I think we have to keep in mind. One, communication everything wasn't so easily public. So, people didn't know a lot until they didn't have the access to information, too much information, disinformation, the whole thing. We're suffering from too much, but they didn't have enough, I think, often. And, when you look at written accounts and so forth, one thing, if you've spent any time in courtrooms like I have, is that eyewitnesses are so unreliable. People think they see something, think they know something, but in point of fact, they may not have any kind of an accurate picture of it. And so, that gets complicated, I think, in an attempt to really understand what in the hell what happened in Germany. We also have to remember that, their economy had gone totally kablooey. The money was worth nothing. They were hungry. So there was a rise of populism which is again what we saw under Trump here. What I still remember reading about a guy who was like a Harley chop shop somewhere in wherever it was in Tennessee or whatever it is. And I remember him saying in the New York Times that he voted for Trump because Trump was his guy. It was just like he was just like Trump, and Trump was going to help him. And I thought, under what possible rationale did this guy think that could be true? I mean, it's just, it was impossible. But I often think that a lot of that must have been going on in Germany. Things were desperate, and they were desperate for somebody, almost desperate for some sort of like Marvel superhero, to come along. And you wind up, I noticed that you wind up investing these leaders like Hitler. Well, I'll stop with the Trump. But anyway, I go to Robespierre, for example, if we want to go way back, and you wind up investing people with amazing powers that they really don't in any way deserve and are not going to wield in a positive way, but it's some sort of desperate grasp at getting out of the situation that you're in. The other thing that you mentioned earlier, which I've thought a lot about, is that Hitler clearly didn't study history, because if he had, he would have looked at Napoleon and he would have said, you know what, Russia's not really the way to go. I mean, the two of them, in a little more than 100 years apart, made exactly the same mistake.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a way, it sort of parallels what we've done in Afghanistan, in the sense of, what were we going to do with it if we won it? What were they going to do with Russia from Paris? What was Hitler really? I mean, Hitler had a little more going on there, in the sense that Berlin and Moscow were not, quite so poles apart. But, what was the object of the enterprise? Were we really going to govern Afghanistan, or Vietnam? And I find it so fascinating that we just repeat ourselves over and over again over the centuries, even though in theory we know how it came out.
Yeah, absolutely. I started writing this novel basically right after Trump had been elected. So I think it goes without saying the Trump years are kind of inflected in it, and it's not to draw an equivalence, but certainly analogy.
Yeah.
And certain resonances. I mean, that was one of the things, kind of seeing ourselves right through the distorted mirror of the past, but where certain things come into focus. And I think Rebecca Solnit had an article just the other day in the New York Times about this kind of peculiar combination of gullibility and cynicism that's at work in American politics right now, like where, cynicism being predominant from the elites who are gulling the masses who are more gullible than cynical, but it kind of requires a heady dose of both in different proportions, depending on who you are. And I think the same thing's at play, just like you said, Barbara. One of the kind of interesting structural comparisons, even though 21st century America, Nazi Germany seem like very different places in so many respects, you could say that they're both kind of crisis moments where, there's a sense of the excesses and devastations of industrial capitalism are being acutely felt, and at the same time you have the coalescence of technology, certain communication technologies that then provide new tools that people don't really realize the kind of power they provide, right, to change public discourse, to shape politics and ideology, and creates this kind of polarizing effect. And I think the same things at play, absolutely. And it creates this kind of weird combination of, anti-democratic but hyper-democratic populism, right? A kind of direct action that we saw precisely a year ago today, which is, it's bizarre to be talking about. I never really predicted when I started to let out, the kind of resonances that came to play a role, as well as then, which I never could have foreseen, this is somewhat unrelated, but that Adrian writing from the kind of bombed out western portions of Berlin with all of the choked with rubble and smoke, he ends up looking a lot like we do when we go to the grocery store lately, with his kerchief and his goggles. And so there were weird kind of correspondences that kept popping up through the composition of this.
Absolutely. Don't forget the French Revolution. I mean, that I think is actually a closer parallel. What you had the elite living in Versailles and growing, richer and more remote all the time. You only have to read the mansion section of the Wall Street Journal every Friday to sort of understand the whole Versailles thing. I'm serious. Yeah. I do it for entertainment, but at the same time, it's real. And then, you have people who are struggling, all the rest of it. But the thing is that almost every revolution tips over into somebody like Robespierre. It almost never ends peaceably. It almost always ends up with a Hitler, Robespierre, Stalin, whatever. We have the only revolution that actually came out, without that, because of the character of George Washington and a few of those other men. Washington didn't want to be king. He was elected president. He served a term, whatever it was, and then he went home. But that never happens, it just doesn't in the history of the world. So I find these parallels really fascinating. I never expected to live through this kind of a thing, because I always thought I was lucky that I was born in 1940 and missed the 1930s. And I didn't expect them to come around when I got to my 80s, and here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the fact that you mentioned, right, that it always ends up into Hitler or Stalin, I think that's one of the things I find interesting about this particular period, and that I kind of try to dramatize in the novel is what Pike recalls in a certain conversation that kind of recurs throughout, kind of has echoes throughout the novel. But he talks about what he calls the dammitness of choice, right? Which is this idea that, in terms of, say, the Spanish Civil War, you could have chosen to defend the Republic like Pike did, or you could have kind of sided with the nationalists to out of fear of communism, right? It's kind of a Bolshevist revolution. And both sides lead kind of off the cliff into an abyss of authoritarianism and murder and chaos. And yet those are the choices you're faced with in a war, right? There's two sides only, and there's a lot of dissenting opinions within those sides. But this is part of, I think, the conflict that animates de Groot's and Pike's relationship, is that they both chose kind of different directions, and yet, but in some sense, they, at least Adrian likes to think that they occupied a middle ground. They're both humanists, right, who saw that there was a choice to be made, and so this idea of how do you choose and live with your choice in the face of the fact that you're kind of damned by whatever you choose, that you can't foresee the unintended consequences, and that whatever you're fighting for, you're kind of aligning yourself with forces beyond your control that maybe even fly absolutely in the face of the ethical choices that are motivating your conduct in the first place.
It's very profound. I'm going to have to think about that. It's an interesting day to be talking about it, isn't it? And on January 6th, a year later, and looking back on what happened and seeing the rationales. I mentioned the Wall Street Journal, which I read for purposes other than its editorial page, which I almost always disagree. But they want to call it a riot, not an insurrection, and I'm not buying that. I'm just not. And I think it's fascinating how tribal things become, and how, but then I think of Ireland as kind of tribal. Would that be a fair thing to say? Or am I completely off base, Patrick?
Me?
Yeah, Patrick, you answer that.
In old times, I'm not saying today, but I do think of it, in earlier incarnations as.
Maybe so. Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit about, the plan in the book, which I thought was great, was, if I've got this right, tell me. So the plan is to deposit the Irish agent via U-boat, which is really cool. I was going to ask you about the U-boat scenes in Ireland. And then his goal was to mobilize the fighters of the outlaw IRA. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on in Ireland at that time, with De Valera and all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So this again was all those aspects of the novel, as wacky as they sound, are all true, which was that the first operation that the Germans had planned to coordinate with the Irish contingent of the planned invasion of Britain. The overall planned invasion was called Operation Sea Lion. The Irish operation, the first one was called Operation Dove. And so the idea was, just like you said, to use someone like Pike, or the real figure Frank Ryan, as in conjunction with this other character who I use in the novel, and I use his real name. His name is Sean Russell. So the real figures actually took a U-boat ride to Ireland, with the plan being is that the actual people, Russell and Ryan, would coordinate with the outlawed IRA. So Eamon de Valera, who was head of the Fianna Fáil government and the Taoiseach of Ireland, basically the president of Ireland, the prime minister of Ireland, was it's kind of hard to talk about this without already immediately getting into the complicated factionalism of Irish history, but he essentially he was a member of Sinn Féin, had fought in the fight for the War of Independence, and then fought in the Civil War, all against, as an anti-treaty member, against kind of making amends with the British and accepting this kind of piecemeal Irish Free State. Once De Valera becomes head of the government in the early 30s, something around then, he kind of becomes he kind of pivots and says, well, let's kind of make somewhat of amends here. We can kind of carve out an independent Ireland kind of from within through democratic means and make peace with this. So he ends up over the course of the 30s outlawing the IRA, the members that he had sided with who had said, we're not accepting any treaty until all of Ireland is unified, right, including the North. So you have this strange situation where you have the IRA kind of split in two, also along left and right, because like everything was splitting along left and right in the 30s. So someone like Frank Pike, my character, was left-leaning socialist, whereas other members of the IRA, folks more like Sean Russell and others were more right-leaning, and the IRA started kind of flirting more with a kind of Catholic nationalism, which also is where the governing party, Fianna Fáil, ended up kind of gravitating towards over the course of the war and into the post-war period. In any event, this creates a very complicated situation, but the reason someone like Frank Pike would be absolutely crucial asset is that he has contacts with both the reigning government as well as the outlaw IRA. So the Germans think that he has the ability to somehow patch up all of these years of violent misunderstandings, and that he can just like forge an alliance between these two groups that are at odds now. And he can unite the IRA, he can unite the government security forces, and then coordinate a German-Irish invasion of England. That was the original plan. And it really was something so kind of facile as ship a couple guys into Ireland via U-boat, have them like make contacts with folks, and then there'll be a flower pot in the window in the embassy in Dublin, German embassy in Dublin, when the German invasion is planned to happen.
You always mention the riddle of the sands, and granted, this is an earlier generation though, right? I mean, this is pre-World War I, yeah. And it's German, aren't they? Isn't it U-boat into England? Isn't that what?
Well, they're up in the northern part of Germany, and it's sort of a reconnaissance of what the Germans might be able to do in the Frisian area.
Okay.
So it's often thought of as the original spy story, or certainly the 20th century spy story. Right. It's so ironic that the author was then, shot as a traitor by the British after the war. I've never quite gotten over that, but it just shows how complicated the whole Irish-English question was. It was the Elizabethans that went to Ireland. I mean, Ireland was not part of England until Elizabeth, towards the end of her reign, sent her, I'm trying to remember his name at the moment, he was later executed. Anyway, he goes off to Ireland to conquer Ireland. And is it Northern Ireland because it was just geographically closer? I mean, why Northern Ireland has appeared, why is that the British part?
Oh, I think a long, too complicated history to get into, but I don't think it's just geographic proximity, but the kind of just the deeply embedded plantation colonies, and just that the Anglo-Irish kind of embeddedness in Northern Ireland, as well as the confessional difference. But as far as what the German operations were concerning, so they all these plans eventually, none of them really came off. Like they tried to actually ship these two guys by U-boat, and Sean Russell ended up dying on board the submarine, dying of a perforated ulcer, which is, again, I think is
wink,
kind
wink,
of
nudge, nudge.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it offered to me, and I think there was some suspicion as to did this man really die of a perforated ulcer? So that's something I had fun playing with. But this, that wasn't the only. Even with that failure, they tried to come up with a few more, but they were most of the rest of them were abandoned. They really never got any off the ground. There were certainly some agents who were deposited in Ireland over the course of the war or earlier on, and they were mostly picked up by the state forces fairly quickly. The Germans didn't have much success in this venture, which I also something that drew me to it is just there was almost a kind of, I don't know, Keystone Cops like goofy quality to all these like bumbling quixotic operations that either never got off the ground, or as soon as they did, they failed.
Well, think about the defense that was mounted against that sort of thing. One of which was that the British went out and took away all the road signs. I mean, or they twisted them around. So if the Germans landed, they wouldn't be able to find their way to wherever it was. I mean, they were so close together. I think that's the other thing that you know, we in America have some trouble grasping is that the distances between Germany and Britain and Ireland are really tiny. I mean, I had the same sort of realization when I was in Jordan, looking, you know, I was at the Dead Sea and I was looking at Jerusalem with the lights at night and recognizing that that whole conflict area would fit into Arizona.
Right.
I mean, it's so small, you know, but we're used to thinking of it in terms of 20th century technology, you know, 20th century travel, 20th century communication. And the fact that 20 miles, you know, doesn't seem like much, but it actually was before we got to all of this technology.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember being in the west coast of Ireland, and their conception of distance is very different than ours. You know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was saying, so how far is it to Doolin? You know, oh, it's a long way. You know, it's like 10 minutes up the road.
But they do think that way. I mean, I always point out to British authors when they're here, you can fit the entire British Isle into Arizona. I mean, the entire British Isle fits in Arizona. But because of the density of the population and all kinds of other things, it takes forever to drive any distance in Britain as compared to us leaping onto the interstate. And, you know, at 75 miles an hour, we can traverse hundreds of miles very, very quickly, whereas they have trouble doing dozens of miles very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, even though I've, you know, only really exclusively grown up and lived in America other than certain stints abroad, to me, it's the immensity of American space seems like the weirder of the two.
Well, it just means that it's hard for us sometimes in America to grasp these conflicts because they seem so small, you know, the space in which they play out, but in fact, they were huge to the people involved.
Yep.
You know, the Second World War is a truly fascinating war. I go back to Ken Follett, who say it's the most interesting war to write about because it's the only war where there was clearly a right side and a wrong side. The only war that, you know, where there were definitely, there are very few shades of gray in World War II. And, you know, I think you've done an interesting job in achieving shades of gray in a very complicated situation where, you know, rights and wrongs and winners and losers and all the rest of it are not very clear as compared to an awful lot of books set in the war.
Well, thanks a lot. That means a lot to me. I that was something I'm definitely was kind of setting out to achieve is to kind of confront the ambiguities. I mean, to me, that's just more interesting. I think there's great value in stories of you know, heroes and villains and clear victims, but the way that complicity and resistance was entangled for so many people, especially within Germany during the war and within the kind of machinations of these kind of transnational spy operations was just something that I found so fascinating. And I think there was more room then to explore a kind of personal relationship and tales of this is a story in some ways of both friendship, you know, how people influence each other in ways that they don't understand themselves. There's also an unrequited love aspect to the narrative, but to me, I was able to tell that story precisely in this space, as you said, of kind of the gray area, the ambiguities.
Why did you decide to make them lovers? I thought that was a really interesting thing.
You know, it wasn't something I set out to do, and it wasn't something I found in the files. It wasn't a calculated thing for me. It's just kind of something that organically sprang up when I was writing the characters, that it just kind of, I don't know, it just happened. Like, just was part of Adrian's character, that he was, and I think it kind of dramatized his inner conflict, which is that he's a closeted gay man in Nazi Germany. Similar, it created this kind of this torqued nature, that he's living kind of in conflict with himself, similar in the way that he's a literary translator who's now found himself kind of fallen into working for the military, for the Nazi state. And so part of what I think that achieved was, again, I didn't calculate it, but I'm kind of thinking about the work that does now. You know, Weimar Berlin, the Berlin of the 20s and the very early 30s was such a such a frenetic, energetic, sexually charged place that was really a kind of hotbed and utopia of gay liberation. There's been some great work done.
Think about Cabaret, which I think,
absolutely right. Christopher Isherwood's stories that inspired Cabaret, and just Gay Berlin was such a defining aspect of the Weimar period that I thought, it's kind of interesting to think about these figures who experienced that, who lived that life. And someone like Adrian, actually, he ends up kind of coming out in somewhat mitigated circumstances, but really being able to live his sexuality out in the 20s, which he then has to basically repress, and it goes to ground like so many identities do with the rise of Nazism. And so I thought that was a kind of an interesting aspect that helped dramatize both Adrian, and then as far as Pike goes, it just seemed natural to me that someone like the Finn Mccool character, at least, even Pike himself in Adrian's telling, is this kind of, fits with his larger than life pansexual character. Pike is not just bisexual, but he's every sexual. He's just a man of massive appetites and libido. And
he just got out of prison, remember?
And he just got out of prison. Yeah.
Excellent point, Patrick. Right.
Yeah.
I love it. Listen, I know, Patrick, you have some other questions you want to ask, and I have a puppy beating at my door here. So I'm going to say it's really been a great pleasure talking to you, Peter. And I am going to hand you over to Patrick, and you guys can wind this up however you would like. Thank you for signing books for us. Let me remind you, The Torque Man, we do have autographed copies. It's our historical fiction book of the month for January. So it's likely that we will run out in a hurry, but I'm sure that Peter, well, let me say that I hope Peter would be kind enough to sign more for us should that actually happen.
I'd be honored to. I look forward to that.
A real pleasure.
He teaches at your alma mater, Barbara.
Sorry?
Peter teaches at your alma mater.
Oh, you do? Are you a Stanford guy?
I'm a Stanford guy.
I didn't know that. Well, I'm a Stanford girl, but I won't tell you when I graduated because it will just depress you.
No, not at all.
Long time ago, right? But wonderful place indeed. We could talk about that another time.
Oh, great.
Anyway, good night, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Good night, Barbara.
Right.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, I'm trying to think if we could always nerd out on all sorts of different things. I think we have a lot of shared interests and things like that. It's interesting just for the people watching, we've given you the broad strokes of what the basic book is about, but there's so many different things that you've managed to accomplish in this book. I mean, it's one of these books that, it's part spy story, it's part, poignant love story in some ways. And it's part rollicking flashman kind of, romp. There's an awful lot of satire. One of the things that I wanted to get into a little bit more deeply was that just the tone. How did you, the two narratives, getting the tone right, the way you liked it, because especially with de Groot, although they both, Pike and de Groot, they have this sort of flamboyance to the narrative, to the style, sort of this arch. Did that take a while to get both of those right?
I mean, it took a little bit of finessing, but I have to say that the kind of kernel of each came to me pretty quickly. I think that they were both a joy to write. I think that there's something about the kind of de Groot's kind of curmudgeonly, elitist kind of literary disdain of the world around him and a modernity that comes a little too easily to me. It just kind of flowed right out of me. Right. And then Pike's was more of almost like, even though that's not me, far from my farther, I would say, from my own natural voice, but it was such a delight to kind of stretch that way, and I felt that I got to be like a bit more inventive and playful with the language. And I remember, in fact, my mom told me this, that one of the games I loved playing when I was a kid, and we always played this with my grandparents, like every holiday, was the game Balderdash. Balderdash?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you invent this fake definition for a obscure word no one's ever heard of. And I never tried to win at Balderdash. I never gave a shit about trying to write like a guessable definition. Instead, I just wanted to write the most ludicrous definition I could think of that would make people laugh.
I wonder if James Joyce played that when he was a kid.
He must have. Yeah. So it was just a kind of a chance to show off and try to elicit laughs and use language in a kind of really colorful way. And I think that joy I'd had ever since I was a kid of trying to kind of make my grandfather like cry with laughter so he couldn't even read the definition. That was what I was channeling a bit in Pike's narrative. I mean, but in a more, kind of controlled, deeply researched way. The other thing that kind of let me channel was just all of the kind of early, as well as the earlier Finn myths, as I mentioned, like the Toyne and the high deeds of Finn Mccool and things like that. It also let me channel, like I said, the kind of Irish modernism. I think like early Beckett, like Murphy, or Flann O'Brien. There's just, there was a certain kind of subset of works that I took and really just culled a lot of diction from to use in this manner. One of the great kind of Ur texts for me was Brendan B. Hand's Borstal Boy.
Yeah, that's
just amazing.
Fantastic book.
So good. And it's just the Irish have an uncanny ability to just like make their language sing. It's so melodious on the page. And it was maybe a bit of a tall order or something. I'm not Irish. I haven't spent any time in Ireland other than being a huge fan of the literature. And so getting to try to channel that in the Finn Mccool narrative was a great challenge and delight.
I'm glad you mentioned Brendan Behan. I mean, he doesn't get enough attention these days, although, people like Shane McGowan and kind of a modern version of Behan. That kind of Dylan Thomas sort of tradition. But people watching, if you want a wonderful book, Borstal Boy. And then he did a couple of plays too, The Hostage, and there's one other one, that major one, The Queer Fellow, I think it is.
Yeah, I've never read the plays.
They're good. Yeah, they're really good.
Check them out. Yeah. It's incredible.
What else was I going to ask you? I just had a thought. Yes, I'm glad I remembered. Without, again, I'm really careful not to give away too many spoilers, but for me, a really crucial aspect of this book was the little girl Gretchen. Can you talk about her without the spoiler?
Yes. Yeah. We don't want to give anything away. Let's see. How do I not give something away?
I know maybe not. Maybe just, this little girl is a very key part of this story, and it's a very moving, poignant part of the story.
Thanks. Really, so I'll just say I'll speak in kind of abstract terms if I can. Was just that I wanted to make sure that I conveyed the gravity and horrors of the Nazi state, right, and their crimes in this period, and I wanted to be able to do that in a way that connected intimately in the first person to de Groot's life. And so I won't say anything specifically, but and maybe in a way that readers aren't deeply familiar with. Maybe some of them are, but I wanted some kind of tangible aspect of that to be a kind of a raw nerve in de Groot's own life, and that informs his relationship with Pike and how then that proceeds in his ultimate character arc. Again, I'm speaking in very vague terms intentionally.
Right. What about, let me see, I had a couple other things I wanted to ask you, but maybe we've said enough. The Spanish, just getting the chronology right, the Spanish Civil War, it's interesting how it immediately precedes the outbreak of World War II, right? I mean, it's like 35 or 36 to 40 or 39.
Yeah, 36 to 39.
36 to 39. And, you make some interesting comparisons between what Franco was up to and, of course, what Hitler was building up to do. There are some definite parallels there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a great book that was recently published, maybe in the last few years, by Paul Preston, who's one of the eminent authorities of 20th century Spain, the Spanish Civil War. and it's called the Spanish Holocaust, which is a kind of confrontational, controversial title, is that he's trying to make the case that the atrocities committed by the Francoists during the war and in the immediate years after amount to something as devastating and kind of genocidal as a Holocaust, one that was waged politically rather than, say, ethnically or religiously. That book was kind of, I've read a lot about the Spanish War, but that book in particular kind of blew me away. And there's some specific anecdotes, I think, that I draw on in terms of of Adrian's stint with Himmler's tour of Spain that come directly out of there. But
was Heydrich along for that, by the way?
I don't believe so.
No,
I don't think so. I could be misremembering. But what was I going to say about Spain?
Sorry to derail you there.
No, quite all right. But yes, I think that idea that that Spain was really the kind of, the warm up, the dress rehearsal, if you will, for the Second World War, was certainly how I think Hitler viewed it. There's no way that Franco would have won the war if it weren't for Hitler's intervention. Hitler and Mussolini both intervened, even though it was unofficial, technically under the table. They were technically neutral, and it was completely obvious that they funded planes, tanks, troops, ammunition, advisors, everything, a whole intelligence service. And so there is a very real sense, it's Stephen Spender, the British poet, he put it that the war in Spain was the war for the soul of Europe. And I think there was a sense of that sense that, that Europe kind of lost its soul in that war, in some sense, because Britain and France didn't intervene. They even though they saw what Germany and Italy were doing, and they still remained neutral. America too. I mean, I think America's biggest involvement was Texaco funded Franco's, basically they literally fueled the war by getting him oil. And then you had a handful of individual combatants who went over to try to defend the Republic heroically, but tragically.
It wasn't Spain itself, and of course, Gibraltar and Morocco and all that area of tremendous strategic importance to the Germans.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, because they wanted to seize Gibraltar from the British. This was a huge shipping access point through the Mediterranean. So this was part of, I think there's a moment in the book that touches on this idea that after Hitler wins Franco his war, essentially, Franco then gets very demanding, and so he's like, well, I'll join your war now if you give me Gibraltar, and makes a bunch of kind of unrealistic demands. So Hitler and Franco, I can't remember how exactly it goes, but they met once in this, I think, same tour where Himmler comes over and tours all around Spain by train. Hitler and Franco had this meeting. And Hitler was so unimpressed with Franco, so deeply bored with him. I can't remember what it is, but it's something like, I'd rather like spend all day at the dentist than hang out with that man again, or something like that.
That would be a good stage play, wouldn't it? Maybe a one actor.
One act Hitler and Franco.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, we digress. But it's really been a treat talking with you, and congratulations, on the book. I wanted to ask you at the beginning of the show, I was mentioning this remarkable illustration. Where does it come from?
Oh, well, the illustration is my own, actually.
You did that?
Yeah. So you only have the ARC, but you'll see, if you see on the inside flap of the finished novel, I get the jacket illustration credit, which was one of my absolute great thrills. It was this book is kind of the accomplishment of two lifelong dreams for me in one fell swoop. So I do art, and I do comics regularly. And so the good people at Harper, my editor and the art director, kind of graciously, they knew about my art. They had seen some stuff I did, and they kind of graciously offered, do you want to take a stab at the cover illustration? And I was, mortified and absolutely overjoyed at once. And so did a bunch of different kind of mock-ups. And then our incredible art director, Milan Bozic, he integrated my drawing into the full design you see here. But to answer your question, that spiral there is a Celtic symbol it's called the spiral of Epona, if I recall correctly. But it's this idea of these, two interweaving strands, which I thought, in addition to being kind of this kind of Irish mythic resonance, also embodied the structure of the novel, that you have these two dueling narratives kind of wrapped around one another, telling their own version of ostensibly the same series of events in slightly different ways, and informing each other kind of as we write in this kind of dialectical way, creating this synthesis at the center. So I knew that the spiral opponent played a role, and then I wanted something that conveyed a kind of espionage, vaguely Nazi-esque atmosphere without it looking like, I didn't want to stamp the cover with a swastika,
right?
But I wanted something that kind of read that way in a playful way, in a kind of more Hitchcockian way too. There's definitely a bit of a Vertigo movie poster style going on here too.
When did you? Because it's such a symbol that does double, triple, quadruple duty in the book. As you just said. When did you arrive at the title? Did it arise in the writing and you said, I'm going to keep that?
I wish I were that smart, but
editor found it.
No, I came up with the title myself, but only when my agent, brilliant woman that she is, said, you need a new title for your book. This is right before we took it out on submission. And I was at first, I spent like 15 minutes devastated, being like, oh, but I liked my original title. And of course, after I took 2 deep breaths, I realized she was absolutely right. And then started.
What was it, by the way?
Oh, sure. The original title was Irish Goodbye.
Irish Goodbye.
Irish Goodbye, which I don't know. I don't know how well known that phrase is, but as I understand it, it's the idea of that. I guess it's a bit pejorative. The idea that the Irish say goodbye by just like leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. I think it's also called a French exit. I believe there's like a kind of way of saying goodbye, drunkenly stumbling off, that's appropriate to every European nationality.
Right.
In any event,
Patrick DeWitt wrote a book called The French Exit, I think.
Yes. I wrote about mother and son bon vivants.
Yeah.
I read that. Is that? Yeah. He's great.
He is.
I love the Sisters Brothers in particular. In any event, she was absolutely right that I needed a new title. And then I kind of came up with a list, and the one that that popped out at me was The Torqued Man, because I had recently reread the Carson translation of the Toyne, and as soon as I saw that, I said, "Oh, this is it," and she agreed. And and I like to think it works.
Awesome. Yeah. Do you still have the original hanging somewhere of your drawing?
The original there's not really an original. It's it's a couple of drawings overlaid on Photoshop. Sadly, it exists like only in the ether. I have to make an NFT of it and sell it for $1 million as for a stupid 2-dimensional form.
That's right. Do a lithograph.
Not 2-dimensional. Yeah, some digital form.
It would make a cool tattoo also.
Yeah. You should get it and send me a picture.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to be the Torqued Man though.
Yeah, that's true. It comes with a lot of baggage.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Peter, it'd be great to see you out here in the desert at some point in person. Maybe when your next book or the paperback edition comes out, you have an open invitation to come out here. We'd love to have you.
Awesome. I would love to. I can't wait. Thanks so much for having me, Patrick.
You bet. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Sorry we went a little bit over time, but what the hell, right?
What the hell?